everybody. Thanks for being here tonight. Thank you all so much for being on time. Also, hello, good evening to everybody who's joining us online. Good to have you with us as well. I'm going to pray for us, and then we'll go ahead and hand off to Pastor Dennis to get us started for week 4 of Sanctuary Bible Institute. Just for the folks in the room, there are snacks there. Eat as much as you want. You would not want to have to take this stuff back home or anything. So enjoy yourself. You know where the restrooms are. Any other questions? Ask Miss Francie. She knows everything. Let me pray for us. We'll go ahead and get started. Lord God, thank you for this time and this space to be together as your church. Thank you for these, my brothers and sisters who are gathered here in the room, as well as those online. Thank you for Pastor Dennis, for his faithfulness to you and for his willingness to be a part of this journey with us through the Bible this year. God, as we lead into your word tonight, might we find encouragement there, might we find direction there, might we find life there. Most ultimately, may we find you in your word. Help us to be your church and the people you called us to be, in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.
Well, amen. It's good to see you all, and I commend you for doing this. I'm impressed. I do think that even though we're going to move fast, it's week 4 and we're only in Exodus, so we're going to move fast. But even though we move fast, I think there's some value in getting an overview of the Bible, and then as you listen to sermons, as you read books, as you do individual study, you can focus in, but you have the panorama, you have the landscape, and that's part of what I'm trying to do here. So I'll press on. I kind of want to emphasize something. Excuse me. I want to emphasize that I think the project, if you were to put it that way, that we're seeing through the Old Testament is clear in God's pact or covenant with Abraham, that we then see threatened and then ratified with the next generation and next generation. Now, I know we sometimes hasten to get to the New Testament because we know the work of Jesus and the ministry of Jesus, but it's all this background and all this experience of God's people that propels us forward to what Jesus is doing. So what I say is that God's on a people building or a community building project, right? That's the essence of the covenant, is that he's making a people, right? He promised Abraham, I'm going to make a great nation. And what we're seeing is how that project is unfolding, even though it comes under threat at different times. Big threat is, of course, the enslavement in Egypt, but then we'll see more how they bring threat on themselves. I also want to acknowledge that this movement of God is not just about Israel as a nation. It'll be about the influence that Israel has on the whole world as a people through whom the Messiah comes. All right, I've said all that. So I'm going to show you, remind you of the outline that I had up there. I won't keep the slides up all the time, but I do want to make a few points. So the outline that I had last time, we left off somewhere in that second one, Journey to Sinai, and I mentioned, the plagues and how the plagues are a clear and direct attack on Egypt's deities, right? It's God showing God's self to be more powerful than Egypt's gods. And then I touched on the law giving at Sinai, and then we'll talk briefly about the golden calf and the creation of the tabernacle or the sanctuary. All right. So coming back, we'll just look at a few scriptures here. We in Exodus 18, the last plague is the death of the firstborn in all the land, not just Egypt. It's everybody. So the people of Israel are told to put the blood on the doorpost, as you might recall, or if you saw the movies, you put the blood on the doorpost, and the angel of death would pass over. That we call the holiday now Passover for that very reason, that the angel of death passed over those who had the blood. And you can see that foreshadowing in all the salvation imagery we talk about in Jesus being the sacrifice whose blood then protects us from the death to come. So that happens in chapter 18. I mentioned chapter 19 last time. I just want to remind us, they stop at Mount Sinai. The Lord says, I'm planning to make a great nation through you. That's the promise in verse 6. He says, I brought you out on eagle's wings in verse 4. This is Exodus 19. And then when he gets to 6, he goes, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the Israelites. This plan for them to be this priestly people, it's a plan to say you're going to show people how to connect to God. That's the function of the priest, right? And then you'll see that same promise or that same description is given in First Peter to now a community of Christian people made up of Jews and Gentiles who are also called to be this priestly nation. In other words, with the inclusion of Gentiles, God's people building mission continues. All right. So I want to highlight that. I do want to mention in chapter 20, we get what we call the 10 Commandments. He actually, I don't know if that in verse 6, scholars will call this the Decalogue. Log is just word, the 10 words. And I think that actually is the language that's used is the 10 words, but we know them to be commands. I won't rehearse them all, but they're in chapter 20. Moses is up on the mountain. God speaks, and there are these 10 commands that are given. You know what? It's worth looking at. Let's look at it. Then God spoke all these words. This is chapter 20. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or there's on the earth beneath, or there's in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. I'm going to stop there because that first half of the commandments seem to be focused upward toward God. And please keep in mind that something I kind of was thinking about last time, and I said it, but really was thinking about a lot this week, how this community of people really don't have an intimate understanding of God in all these years they're enslaved in Egypt. And the reason why I'm saying this is because we see it in the call of Moses in chapter 3. Whom shall I say sent me? He doesn't even know how to name this God or describe this God. And God talks about himself in that chapter 3 and says, tell them I am sent you. And that's the foundation of the word Yahweh. So the verb to be. So you have this self-disclosure of God going on at the same time that God is building people. So we kind of fault them for the mistakes they make along the way. And yes, they certainly deserve some blame. But you should see it as the stumbling baby steps of people trying to figure out who they are. I mean, you're going to see the golden calf incident, a few chapters later. And you might say, why in the world are these people worshiping a golden calf when God is talking to Moses up on the mountain? They don't have an experience with God apart from what they've been seeing in Egypt, where the gods take these animal forms. Gods take on the form that they give to the gods. So now you see these commands. God is saying clearly, don't think of me the way you've seen other nations think of God. I'm not like that. So you're not going to make something you think I look like. You're not going to have any other kind of being in my place. God is establishing a uniqueness of God's self. So I want you to see those commands. And so, I mean, even though I know this big political movement, you got to put the commands up in the school and all this kind of stuff. I mean, without helping people understand what's going on, they become just another idol. You can just have this thing sticking up there and say, oh, good, we're so holy now. But the idea behind them is to see how unique God's people are compared to the way the rest of the nations, at least at this time, have been worshiping. All right, so I know it might sound a little bit preachy, but that's what I wanted to get through. So those first five tend to look upward about God. And then you start to see the next five seem to look, let's say, horizontally, how we relate to the people around us. Honor your father and your mother so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God has given you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. And that coveting goes on and on and on, different things to covet, right? But the point is, there's setting a foundation for how to relate to God. So, vertical relationship and how to relate to others around. And so these 10 commandments become the basis for more, um, I'll say commands, but I also want to say guidelines and more instruction. Instruction is probably the best word. The word Torah, by the way, means instruction. We often translate it law, but Torah in Hebrew does mean instruction. So God has given instructions about himself and how the communities relate to each other. So from these 10, so we start with these 10, right? And then you'll start to see when we get to Leviticus in just a few minutes that there'll be sort of an elaboration on how to carry out these 10 commandments in everyday life and in community life. Excuse me. Just a couple more things from Exodus. I just want us to, I don't know, somehow internalize a little bit. We see the law. A little pet peeve of mine. I'll show it in chapter 31. Okay, the little pet peeve is that every time we talk about spiritual gifts, this is when I was younger, not so much now. People would downplay skills that you can do with your hands and make spiritual gifts be only those things that seem more mystical, the things that somebody might say, or the faith it can show, or the list that we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, speaking in tongues or healing and those kinds of things. So some people call those sign gifts, and sometimes we tend to focus on that. So people would separate a gift from a talent, so my little pet peeve is, I think they're all gifts from God's Spirit. And what backs me up on this is Exodus 31. When we're about to get to what's life going to look like in the wilderness, we're introduced to these two people with funny names, Bezalel and Aholiab. And I like to point them out. So the Lord spoke to Moses, "See, I have called by name Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. And I have filled him with a divine spirit and with ability, intelligence, and knowledge of every kind of skill to devise artistic designs, to work in gold, silver, and bronze, in cutting stones for setting, and in carving wood, to work in every kind of craft. Moreover, I have appointed with him Aholiab, son of Ahishamach, of the tribe of Dan, and I have given skill to all the skillful so that they may make all that I have commanded you." They are about to do some creative work in building the sanctuary or the temple. The forerunner of the temple, sanctuary or the tabernacle. And God is saying, I gifted some people with skills, with some real physical, they are artists. So I always like to point that out because we somehow diminish, the church has for years diminished artists or put artists in certain categories, and somehow downplay. And our society tends to do that, right? We tend to say, well, you got to have a marketable skill. So you got to be good at, right now, I guess it's STEM. You got to be good at science, technology, engineering, math. And artists, that's the first thing you cut from schools, right? Because who needs music and art? But God gifted these people with these skills. And anyway, I just want to, that's a little, like I said, it's a pet peeve. So, but I'll keep going. Two other things. One is chapter 35, when Moses is up. I'm sorry, 34 rather. Moses is up on the mountain. This is at the end of chapter 34. And he's been up there for a while, and his face, when he comes down, his face is shining. And the reason why I pointed out is that it's something that the Apostle Paul will pick up in First Corinthians when he talks about Moses' face being so, bright that he had to veil it, because people can't really take the glory of God. It's overwhelming, and Moses only gets a reflection of God's glory, and that's overwhelming to the point that he's got to veil himself. Right? That's another foreshadowing of what happens on the mountain of transfiguration when Jesus is on the mountain and he shines to the point that it's overwhelming to the disciples and the three that are up there, and they don't know what to do. Peter says, well, let's build 3 tents, you, Moses, Elijah. It's this moment, this monumental kind of thing. Now, you are all, oh, I can't see you all there, but some of y'all are 90s babies. And there was a popular Christian song in the Christian praise song category, "Shine, Jesus, Shine." And one of the lines, if I'm trying to remember, it says, "As we gaze on your kingly brightness, so our faces portray your likeness, ever changing from glory to glory. Nearer here, may our lives tell your story. Shine, Jesus, shine." I like that line because of the "as we gaze on your kingly brightness." It's actually, this is that thing. It's what's happened with Moses. He's shining the glory of God to the people. So that's something I wanted to highlight. But then I end this with the building of the tabernacle or sanctuary to house the Ark of the Covenant, which is a box, basically. It's a box that has the 10 Commandment tablets inside, the 10 Commandments 2.0, because the first set of tablets, Moses was so upset when he saw the golden calf, he threw them and broke them. So he threw the tablets down, frustrated that these people are having all kinds of wild activity and building a golden calf when he's up on the mountain talking to God. So he destroys the tablets, and I shouldn't laugh, but it is kind of a wild scene. And then he gets a new set that God works in chapter 34. God says God writes these with his hand. So God created new tablets like the former ones. They put those in the Ark of the Covenant. And that box was where the Ark stayed, as well as Moses' staff went inside the Ark of the Covenant. There'll be other stuff they'll put in there too over time. But the other thing about it is that the Ark had figures of angels on the top of the Ark. However they looked, we can only imagine. But these angels on there, and that spot was where God's presence was said to dwell. I'm old, so I think of old music. Sorry. But there's an old song. Come ye disconsolate, where ye languish. Come to the mercy seat, fervently yield. The chorus says, earth has no sorrow that heaven cannot heal. The mercy seat was what that spot was called between angels, where God's presence was said to dwell. That's also going to be picked up in the New Testament when we talk about the place of atonement, where God's presence dwells. And it becomes the cross in Paul's theology in Romans 3. So we're being set up here to understand what's going to happen in the ministry of Jesus if we can appreciate all that God is doing through God's people through the Old Testament. It's not just to set us up for that. I mean, it ultimately will do that. Of course, it has meaning in its time, but it also sets up something for the future. But I want to end with chapter 40, just the last few verses, because I feel like it's a beautiful image at the end of Exodus. This is chapter 40. I'm going to start at verse 34. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. That's a nice little parallel thing. The tent of meeting, that's where they set up the tabernacle, is the sanctuary. The cloud is in parallel with glory of the Lord. So the cloud covers the tent. The glory of the Lord fills the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled upon it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Whenever the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle, the Israelites would set out on each stage of their journey. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out until the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and fire was in the cloud by night, before the eyes of all the house of Israel at each stage of their journey. It's a beautiful picture of God guiding the people through this cloud of God's very presence. Cloud of fire at night, and the cloud, this pillar of this cloud by day. In Aramaic, the word Shekinah, we say Shekinah in English, means presence. So God's Shekinah, God's presence, was with the people, and Exodus ends with the very presence of God in the cloud in the cloud and in the pillar of fire. To me, that's just a beautiful way to think about going through the desert, going through the wilderness, because the wilderness is a lonely spot, right? And here God is with God's people, guiding them by night and day. So that's a hopeful note, even though it's a desert journey, right? Okay. All right. Any comment, question on Exodus? Because we really will turn the page and get to Leviticus. So anybody, any questions, comments, and I guess they could come through the Q&A feature too.
Pastor Dennis?
Yes.
I just wanted to give a reminder to everyone online. I saw a hand raised. I think that was from Denise. Please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A chat. That way we can address them as soon as there's an opening. PE could answer some right online. Pastor Dennis can answer while he's speaking. But yeah, please make sure you drop your questions in the Q&A section.
Thank you. All right. Well, I am going to press on to Leviticus. Notice again, I keep reiterating some certain things, that the names of these books are coming from the time when the Greeks were running the world, so many years later. So Leviticus is really about the priesthood, the children of Levi, and Levi, one of the offspring of Israel, of Jacob, becomes the father of all the priests, right? And so when they get into the promised land, everybody gets a portion of the land except the Levites. They don't get a portion of land. They get a tenth from all the others so they can perform the priestly duties. That's a forerunning of why we pay people who do ministry, devote their lives for ministry, because it was their job to do the spiritual work for the whole community. So everybody chipped in to pay them, and they didn't get a spot of land. They didn't get an inheritance in land. But we're in Leviticus, and I have just a few things. Let me see. I'm going to come back to my slides. This is where, when you're doing your Bible reading through the year, and you're all zealous because, there's a lot of drama in Exodus. So, but then when you get to Leviticus, especially when you're reading those passages at night, you can feel kind of tired. All right, so I'm going to highlight a few things. One is that Leviticus, a key message is that of holiness. It's establishing who God is and how the people are to respond to God. Now, when I got a chance, thanks to Pastor Edwin, I got a chance to preach at the sanctuary it's just been a few, I don't know when that was, Pastor Edwin. I was going to say weeks, but we were talking about, you were preaching through First Peter. So I came in and did a message on that very, on chapter 1, where Peter echoes what's being said here in Leviticus, be holy for I'm holy. And and I'm defining holiness as devotion first, because we can get to separation. But when we start with separation, we think of holiness then in terms of simply not doing something. There's a lot of religions that not do something, right? But not all of that is born out of a devotion to God. It could very well be out of a fear, out of a habit, out of whatever. But the idea of separation follows after, in my argument, follows after devotion. So when my heart is fully devoted to God, that's when I start to see myself pulling away from the things that don't help. And that's part what we do in Lent. We say, in my devotion to God, let me be deliberate about stepping away from certain things, or let me focus again on what salvation is about. So I'm drawing your attention. I'm skipping a lot of chapters, but I'm going to draw your attention to Leviticus 19. You start to see the instructions playing out in every area: food, clothes, neighborly relations, how you're going to live, how you're going to set up your house. Everything pretty much is being talked about. But when we get to chapter 19, I want you to see what's behind it. I'm going to start at 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to all the congregations of the Israelites and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. You shall each revere your mother, your father." So he starts to get onto some specific things. But that's the key there, I believe, to understanding what Leviticus is about. It's about the people starting to look like God. And once again, the drama that's unfolding is God's building a people. He had the patriarchs and matriarchs. People grew in Egypt, but they did not grow in an understanding of God. There was no clear way for them to do that, enslaved in Egypt. And God starts to establish himself in front of them, and now starts to order their common life, how they are to live, which, by the way, is very distinct from the nations round about. I mean, one of the key ways is just in how they eat. Now, one of the questions that comes up that I honestly can't answer, and scholars do wrestle with this a lot, is why certain laws exist. I mean, on the surface, at least we know on the surface, it provides a distinction between the people of Israel and the rest of the nations. But why certain particular laws, I will just say straight out, I don't know. Like, why can't you eat shrimp? I don't know. And some have argued because they're dirty. So you don't eat the pork, right? Because it's dirty. Um, and so we might be able to derive a certain kind of we can make an argument for that. But why two different kinds of fabrics can't be worn together at the same time? Oh, that's not clear to me, right? So I'll admit I'm not an expert on Leviticus. So when I get to those things, I do consult the experts in the commentaries to see what kind of thinking they have on that. But before you ask me why they couldn't do certain things, I'm going to tell you straight up front, I don't know. Other than the distinction that some of those things created for the nation as compared to others. I'm sure there's some argument to be made for the cleanliness, some argument to be made for purity, those kinds of things. But some things are still kind of mysterious. In that same chapter 19, not only are we taught about holiness, we taught about love, and we almost forget that. We think about Leviticus in terms of the rules and regulations, and forget that if we keep on going in that chapter, when we get to actually, I'll start at 17 because I think it reaches a climax there. You shall not hate in your heart any one of your kin. This is 19:17. You shall reprove your neighbor, or you will incur guilt yourself. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Now, you've heard those words before. By the time Jesus shows up and he's asked, what's the most important in the law? He's going to quote two things from the Torah. The first one we're going to see when we get to Deuteronomy in a moment. You love the Lord with your whole heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. That's going to come in Deuteronomy 6. And then he cites this right here from Leviticus. Love your neighbor as yourself. So that it's not a new commandment. That's what John says in First John. What I'm giving you, it's not a new commandment. This has been around for a while, but it's been emphasized, and I would even say demonstrated in the life of Jesus, right? A couple other things I'll say, I'm just going to go over this slide, that we start to see the sacrificial system put in here. Sacrifices that are gifts, that are communion, meaning the way that they connect with God. Expiation, I'll explain that word in a minute. Well, I'll explain it right now. Expiation is usually a term that means um, how to clean up what's dirty. But I mean that spiritually. It's like when you're not fit to be in God's presence, expiation cleans you up to be there. So you'll see in the New Testament, there's a word for it, hilasterion, but it's often translated now in your NIV. Almost every modern translation will say sacrifice of atonement, rather than an old word like expiation. Nobody uses that word anymore. But what I'm trying to do is describe the function. The sacrifice is a gift to God. It's a way that we commune with God, and it's also a way of forgiveness of sin. And that's the expiation part, is to say, God, take away my sin. And it's shown in the way animals were slaughtered and then burned whole to demonstrate in a very physical, visceral way the taking away of sin. It's in this book that we have the term scapegoat, which is in our society now, but there was literally a goat that they would put their blood on the goat to symbolize the taking away of sins, and that goat would be sent off, and to be the one that would bear, take on the sin. I already mentioned the name of the book, Leviticus. It emphasizes the priesthood. I mentioned, oh yeah, sorry. Holiness is in these chapters 17 to 26. And then I'm going to quote what a couple of scholars say. The book of Leviticus is the center of the Pentateuch. This placement conveys the importance of worship for the life and well-being of the community. Now, it's center, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, right? Literally in the middle. And this scholar wants to say that's quite purposeful. It's showing you that Leviticus is helping you see how worship is the center of the life of these people. And my words are, Leviticus is fundamentally about worship. It centers on the holiness of God. And Leviticus unfolds a relationship between holiness and ethics, and even more provides background for grasping the significance of Christ's sacrificial death. So that's what I'm getting at, is that a lot of what we see in Leviticus, even though it might be confusing because we don't understand the context of why certain laws were necessary, what we do see is they somehow point to what Jesus did, especially on the cross. And so the New Testament writings are often reflecting back, even through a lens of Leviticus, as obscure as this book might be. The common question people will ask is, are we supposed to be doing all these laws? Well, I don't think so. But what I would say is that the apostles did, and Jesus did. And that's the thing sometimes it's hard for people to grasp. If he's a good Jew, he did them. And one of the things that shows up is when we're starting to read the New Testament, one of the biggest issues that I think we sometimes miss is that Paul is writing, particularly Paul, is writing to largely Gentile communities where there are Jewish people who follow Jesus. And a big issue for him is, how are these people going to get along? Jewish people have this world that they've lived in and has been developed and created over time. And it's not illegitimate. It's a God-given world. But then you have these Gentiles who didn't come through that world, but they came to know Christ also. So the question is now, when you got the potluck and you smell the bacon, it's like, wait a second. The Jewish people say, you're not supposed to do that. And the Gentiles are like, we've always done that. So Paul keeps trying to write, because you've got some people say, well, okay, if we're going to get them all together, we're going to have to make the Gentile converts do the same rituals that we did, particularly, and you see this in Galatians, circumcision and the dietary laws. Those would be the markers. Those would be the obvious distinctions. And you see Paul push back on it. Now, he doesn't say that Torah observant Jews have to stop observing the Torah, but he does distinguish between what he calls weak and strong when he gets to Romans, because he thinks the weak ones are saying everybody's got to do what we do. And the strong would be these Gentile converts that said, we never had to do that before. Why should we have to do that stuff now? So it does become an issue by the time we get to the New Testament. But what we should probably understand is that Jesus doesn't thumb his nose at his own culture or his own religious background. Right? That's something I know we'll talk about. But if you stay with us long enough, we'll get to the New Testament, and you may wind up asking about that. All right, I'm going to actually move on from Leviticus. So even though there's so much there, well, let me stop for a moment. A little point for a question before I go on to Numbers. Any question that I don't mind saying I don't know an answer, so don't think. So I call it question and response, Q&R, not Q&A, because I'll give a response even if it's not an answer.
I was going to ask
Yes.
you, there's one observation I have is there is a growing interest among some young men, particularly young
Mhm.
Black men, and maybe some of the expressions of Christianity or other religions that are more rigid and dogged about some of these kind of
Yeah.
practices. And they
Right.
would point evangelical Christians as fake Christians, false Christians, weak Christians, because we don't do all these rigid things. Have you
Right.
seen that?
Yes, and yeah. I mean, actually, that's a good point, Pastor Adrian. There's always seems to be at some points in time folks who do rise up and say, you've got to do that. I mean, one of the biggest movements is not even as that rigid, but was the Adventists, right? The Adventists, Seventh Day Adventists would say, "Look, you've changed the day. You're supposed to worship on Saturday. That's what the Jews did," and then that can turn into a whole way of thinking. And some of what you just talked about, Pastor Edwin, I'm seeing it too. I think I I don't know. I don't think this is particularly controversial, but when people want to show devotion to God, for some reason, some people like to still find a way to create a separation between people. So they'll say, well, let's do these things because these other people don't do them. I mean, in some ways, that's actually is what happened with Israel. God says, do these things because nobody else around is doing that. It was a way to show God's presence. But that was supposed to point us towards something, right? Point us towards something. And Paul will say it by the time we get to the New Testament. These things were supposed to show us that we needed Christ. And so when Jesus comes, he says in Matthew 5, I didn't come to destroy the law, right? To abolish it. I came to fulfill it. I came to show you what the whole point is, right? So if the whole point is Jesus, then we don't have to adopt rituals and customs that were not part of our world. I mean, we didn't grow up Jewish. We don't have to become Jewish to be Christian. And that becomes very strong message in the New Testament. You don't have to take on the Jewish uh, practices of Torah to follow Jesus. That's actually the point of Galatians, right? So I guess what I would say is if people want to do certain make lifestyle choices out of devotion to God, I'm not going to stop them. But if you start telling me that I have to do exactly what you do, then that's when I start to have the issues, because I don't think that that's something that's taught in the New Testament. Yeah, I think I'll go with that. Thanks. It looks like I see a hand back there. Yes.
I have a question about kind of the conversation around people who practice Judaism and
way to do it without having to get on your hands and knees and crawl across the floor.
So, there's really no place that you won't take your dice in. And I always say, don't baby it.
I don't know what that was. Was that the TV?
Yeah.
Oh, somebody in the Q&A said if we could repeat the question that's in the classroom. I'll try to. I mean, that comes up in the room. I'll try to do that. But could you say again? I'm sorry, I missed some of it.
yes. So my question Judaism who are born into traditionally, who I know they might be called reform group, but
Yes. Okay.
like they believe that Christ is resurrected, so you choose to follow that and maybe
Oh, okay. Messianic Jews, they probably call themselves.
Messianic Jews.
Yeah.
So, is there like conversation, like common about that, about if they no longer like practice certain things?
Yeah. I think the gist of the question for the people online is for Jewish people, probably the people we're thinking of as call themselves Messianic Jews, who the question is they're practicing the Old Testament rituals. You're saying, um,
Who no longer practice?
oh, who no longer, right? Okay. Well, I think for some of them, I can't speak for all because I know some, and and they have been pretty. Well, I don't want to oversimplify. There's a whole rabbinical tradition around what to do with the Old Testament, right? Especially when you don't have a temple. It's like, how do we carry out all these rituals we're supposed to do? We're not doing the animal sacrifices. We're not doing so. Even within Judaism, there's a conversation about how do we carry out the Old Testament teachings in a contemporary world. So I can't speak, universally, and I'm not Jewish, so I don't want to presume anything. But for my Jewish friends and who would be more, well, those who are still Jewish, who would call themselves Jewish, are either Messianic or they might be more Reformed. I have known some people a little more conservative. They find they have a way of practicing some of these rituals. They fit into certain categories, right? So they're not doing everything without the temple, but they're doing some of these things, right? I'm from New York, so there's a whole, conservative group, the Hasidim, the ones with the curls on the side and wear the hat, and so I'm part of your. So they carry out some of the rituals in their world and in their household and such, even though they can't do all the rituals that are in Leviticus. So I guess what I want to say is some people still are trying to practice as much as they can of the Torah. Some Messianic Jews still do, and you'll find congregations of Jews who believe in Jesus who still practice some of their Jewish tradition. I know one young guy, he still wears the yarmulke, kippah, they call it. Kippah means cover, and he but he's a Christian. But one of his parents was Jewish, so he has kind of maintained his Jewish identity and still, worships Jesus. So I guess I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I would say for some Jews they still believe they're following the law. But I'm really truncating a big conversation. I mean, because we're talking hundreds of years of Judaism, and as Jews were in the diaspora all around the world and hated almost everywhere they ended up, they've had to modify what they do. They've had to contextualize what they do. So they practice Judaism. It just doesn't look in the rituals exactly like it did here. So hopefully that's getting at what you were asking. Any other Leviticus question? All right. Well, I'm going to press on to numbers. We might actually finish the Pentateuch tonight, but well, finish. We're not finishing in any way. We are. We will get through an introduction. Okay. So when we get to numbers, it's called numbers because of the numbers. I mean, it's not a joke. That's the name of the book because there's so many numbers that show up in the book in terms of counting the people, But it is an interesting notion is that while they're in the desert, now in Hebrew, the opening words start out in the wilderness. Now, this Hebrew word midbar means we translate it either wilderness or desert. It can mean both of those things. And but that's how the book opens up. Bemidbar in the wilderness. So in Hebrew, that's how it is. But for us, it's numbers because there's so many numbers, and there's a census even at the very beginning of the book. There's like a head count of all the people. Moses takes a head count, and you've got all the numbers of people from each family group, right? That's going. So that's why we call it numbers. But I'm just going to highlight a few things about the book. And just a second. Am I still sharing the screen? No. Okay, let me do that now. Okay, there we go. So some theological ideas. We're going to look at numbers 11, 12, and 13 in a moment. But so that's what I'm going to center on. But I've called it Israel's adolescence in the desert. So again, they're growing into being something and being a people. I I don't use the term nation yet because they're not that yet. They are a bunch of families connected, right? They're connected by blood. They're a big, huge family group, right? And it's big and huge, and the family groups are, coming from the descendants of Jacob, these 12 sons who are arranged in we used to say tribes. I think that was an old King James version translation. So the 12 tribes of Israel, but they're family groups, these 12 groups of people. So that's where they are, and they become like a loose confederation by the time they actually get to the the promised land. They're a confederation of tribes. They're starting to organize themselves. That's the end of Exodus and into Leviticus. They're starting to have rituals and regulations and instruction to guide them as a people. But it's their as adolescents. They're figuring out who they are, and they're making some big mistakes. And Numbers shows us there's sin and judgment in the book, and that's actually a big part of it. It's Israel messing up and God uh, forgiving and getting them back on track. And Moses actually gets to be, in most cases, the intercessor. God says, I'm tired of these people. And Moses says, if you wipe them out, God, all the nations around about will say you're no better than their gods. And God says, yes, I'm holding back. I'm not going to wipe him out. But he gets tired of these people along the way. I'm laughing because it sounds like at times like an exasperated parent with a child. And that's why I'm saying it's their adolescence. They're still growing up. You see a bit more on the sacrifices, on purification, on the duties of the priesthood. That shows up in there. But you also see God's providential hand on these people as they're traveling through the desert and they face their threats. The journey on paper doesn't look far. I mean, if you take a map from Egypt to present day Jerusalem, it's not that far. But it took them 40 years to settle in there, or at least some long time, because it was during this time of wandering the desert that they're growing up. But part of that was punishment. So anyway, I just want you. That's kind of an overarching thing. So I joke why the name, because it's literally numbers. There's census taking, and now we can turn to 11, 12, and 13. And I just want to highlight some of the things I was talking about. So in 11, you got the people marching through the desert, and they complained. So here, 11:1. Now, when the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes, the Lord heard it, and his anger was, I'm going to stop sharing here. And his anger was kindled. Then the fire of the Lord burned against them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. But the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire abated. So that place was called Taberah, which I think means burning, because the fire of the Lord burned against them. The camp followers with them had a strong craving, and the Israelites also wept again and said, if only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we used to eat in Egypt for nothing. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there's nothing at all but this manna to look at. So here's Moses, the forerunner to Harriet Tubman, got to get these people out of slavery. And they like, I kind of wish I was back in Egypt. It's like, and we say, leave them, but anyway, but that's not what Moses said. So y'all don't want to go to the promised land? Stay out here in the desert. But they start to reminisce and act as if being in slavery was okay because we had food, at least access to some food. There's the So they're complaining. Now, I didn't have us read the section where God gives them the manna, but as they're going through the wilderness, they're hungry, and God starts to show, do miraculous work in there, right? He gets them water to come out of a big rock that Moses hits this rock and water comes out so they have fresh water. And then he gives them food from heaven, this manna, which nobody really knows what it was. In fact, they didn't know what it was. I mean, you probably know the word manna means in Hebrew, what is it? So the food is a question. Manna, what is it? So they got the what is it every day with a double portion on Friday, so they wouldn't go out to have to pick any on Saturday. So God, built into the system where they didn't have to work on the Sabbath and provided this manna for them. And they were able to bake with it. They were able to make food to live off of. They complained about that though, when by the time we get to chapter 11, they get so upset. They said, well, we had all this other food and now all we got is this manna. Now, verse 7 starts to try to explain it. It says, now the manna was like coriander seed, and its color was like the color of gum resin. Now that's my NRSV. You might have a slightly different translation in your NIV. It says the people went around and gathered it, ground it in mills or beat it in mortars, then boiled it in pots and made cakes of it. And the taste of it was like the taste of cakes baked with oil. When the dew fell on the camp in the night, the manna would fall with it. So God had this, whatever it is, deliver it every night and made it so that they could mill it, right? They could put it in the mortar and cook with it. But after a time, they got frustrated with that. So, and I guess you're saying I would too. But the point is, it was an example of God providing something out of nothing. They're in the desert, they got nothing, and God gives them something. So by the time you get to the end of chapter 11, you'll see, where is it? God brought quail for them to eat as well, and at the end of the chapter. So God allowed for them to have some kind of bird to eat. Probably tastes like chicken. Just kidding. But they had some kind of meat to eat, right? But then in chapter 12, this is when we get the siblings of Moses, Aaron and Miriam, jealous that God is speaking so much through Moses. And they said, doesn't God speak to us too? Why is Moses so special? And they brought this up after he married an African woman. Now, what we don't know is who was this woman, because she's not named. And it does seem that the wife that was named Zipporah, who's Midianite, doesn't seem to be this woman. So it seems like Moses took another wife at some point, and it could be Zipporah is dead by now because they are, in the chronology of Exodus, he's pushing 100, right? So he was 40 years before he got his call, 40 years as they're going through, and then there's another 40 years. So his life is up to 120. But anyway, the point is, he's married an African woman, and Miriam and Aaron start to express their jealousy that God is speaking. And God comes back and comes down to visit them and takes them to task. I'm going to read just a little bit. I'm at verse, I'll start from the beginning. While they were at Hazeroth, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had indeed married a Cushite woman. And they said, has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? And the Lord heard it. Now the man Moses was very humble, more so than anyone else on the face of the earth. Suddenly the Lord said to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, come out, you three, to the tent of meeting. So the three of them came out. Then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both came forward. And he said, hear my words. When there are prophets among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to them in visions. I speak to them in dreams. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly, not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And the anger of the Lord was kindled against him, and he departed. So it does sound like dad chastising the kids, right? I mean, okay, you three, come out here. Let me deal with this. But that's part of this growing up that they're doing, right? Is is figuring out how God relates to them and overstepping their boundaries. And here, God actually punishes Miriam, and and some scholars have started to note more boldly. It used to be subtle when I was a young man. Now I'm hearing scholars say it more boldly that there's some clear racial overtones in this. You've got this African woman that he's married, a dark-skinned African woman from Kush, and what happens to Miriam? She's turned white as snow and put outside the camp. So there's this stark contrast that's made in her punishment, and it looks like she's got leprosy, skin disease. She's made white, and she's got to stay outside the camp for a week. And Moses is the one who pleads to God that she be spared. So she has to stay out of the camp for a week, and then she can rejoin the community. These three chapters are kind of pivotal in the book. So I mean, there's some other big stuff that happened. 11, 12, 13. I mean, there's some things that happened later on with a false prophet, a guy named Balaam, 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 right? Yeah, I think I said it right. And he's going to be an example of what not to do. And it gets picked up in the New Testament. He's the one who is he's going to prophesy for money. And on the way, uh, his donkey stops in the middle of the road, seeing an angel that Balaam can't see. This is around the 20s, something. And the donkey starts talking to him. I mean, he's beating the donkey to get the donkey moving again. And I'm saying donkey because the King James says ass, and people laugh when you say that. But he's because he beat his ass, and but the ass started talking. But the ass started talking to him, and that's what freaked Balaam out. Is that the animal starts talking to him, and and the and God uses the animal to shame the prophet. So that's another big story in here. But I didn't center on that one. I'm just touching on it. I think what's really one of the key stories I didn't want to lose is what's happening here in 13. I technically it goes to 14, but I'll say 13. It's when they're on the verge of the promised land. They've already been in the desert for some time. They're on the verge of the promised land. And Moses puts together a group of spies, 12 men, to go check out the land before they go in. And been kind of a lot of sermons on this. But in the first part of 13, I won't, let's see, I didn't want to read all the names, but from 13, 1 through 16, God is when Moses is picking all the men. So he's picking one person from each of the 12 family groups, right? And so I will leave out all the names, but you should know. I'm just going to go to the last one, 16, because he's famous. These were the names of the men whom Moses sent to spy out the land. And Moses changed the name of Hoshea, son of Nun, to Joshua. He's key, right? Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan and said to them, go up there into the Negev and go up into the hill country. Negev is south, and then go up north to the hill country. So they're supposed to spend a lot of time looking in the land and see what the land is like and whether the people who live in it are strong or weak, whether they are few or many, and whether the land they live in is good or bad, whether the towns that they live in are unwalled or fortified, and whether the land is rich or poor, and whether there are trees in it or not. Be bold and bring some of the fruit of the land. Now it was the season for the first ripe grapes. So they went and they took their time to check all this out. And then when we get down to verse 25, at the end of 40 days is stereotypical testing time in the Bible. Now, one could argue, do we mean exactly 40? Maybe not. Could be 30, could be 45. But 40 is used very consistently to show the period of testing time. It's Jesus in the desert, 40 days. It's 40 years in the wilderness. It's 40, 40, 40. So we know this is a testing time. And they come back and they come to Moses and Aaron, to all the congregation of the Israelites in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to all the congregation. They showed them the fruit of the land. And they reported to him and said, we came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey. That's not to be taken literally. It's not just as cows and bees. That's a symbolic way of saying it's got all we need. It can nourish us. The land can nourish us. And this is its fruit. Yet the people who live in the land are strong, and the towns are fortified, very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the land of the Negev. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live by the sea and along the Jordan. So now the anxiety is building, right? There's all this good stuff about the land, but there's people. But Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let's go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it. Then the men who had gone up with him said, we're not able to go up against the people. They are stronger than we are. So they brought to the Israelites an unfavorable report of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land that we have gone through as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great size. There we saw the Nephilim, which they're somewhat, these are people we saw way back in Genesis 6, when we went through Genesis. The Anakites come from the Nephilim. And to ourselves, we seemed like grasshoppers. So we seem to them. So you see this critical moment. They're on the verge of going into the promised land, close enough to send these people to do reconnaissance. And you come back where 10 of the folks are like, oh my goodness, it's overwhelming. We can't do this. And Caleb and Joshua say, oh, yes, we can. And you have in this moment this tension, and the people, they accept the report of the majority. All kinds of sermons in this chapter, right? I won't preach them, but I'll tell you a quick funny story because I always tell stories. So I was a young pastor in New York, and I preached on this passage. I don't even remember how I did it, or what I was emphasizing, but I preached on this passage. And there was a couple in the church that was not there that Sunday. And I'm sorry, they were there that Sunday, and then they were gone afterwards. And when they came back, they had traveled, went away. They actually had traveled to Washington, D.C., and heard the pastor there, who happened to preach the following week on the very same passage on Numbers 14. So they came back with a tape of that pastor's sermon, basically to tell me how it should be done. And that pastor was famous in D.C. H. Beecher Hicks had a big church, Metropolitan Baptist Church, a large man with a large presence, large voice. And but I played the tape, and actually with the whole family, we were around the dinner table. My kids were really little, but we played the tape. And he called the sermon, and I can't mock his voice, but he had a powerful voice. He said, "The tragedy of thinking the worst." So that was his message. And and you could see where he was going with that, right? You have the 10 who were thinking the worst, and you had the 2, the minority report, that was the faithful report. And the tragedy was they believed the majority report, and in doing so, God was ready to kill them all, and except for a remnant that he said, I will build a remnant through you, Moses, because these people are stubborn. And Moses intercedes yet again for the people in chapter 15. And some of them die right then, but it's right then when God says it's going to be 40 years before y'all get it to the land. I mean, it's right there. But because of their lack of faith, they're going to wander in the desert some more. So that definitely was the tragedy of thinking the worst. And so the rest of Numbers starts to paint the picture of them wandering through the desert when they could have truncated that journey if they only had faith. All right, so I'm stopping there for Numbers, but chapters, I stopped at 13. I should have probably said 11 to 14, but those chapters are really critical in the life of Israel and why they missed out early on. But then we meet 2 heroes that we're going to meet later, Caleb and Joshua. We meet them there, and we'll see them again in a couple of books. Okay, any thoughts or comments or questions, observations on Numbers? All right. Some of you may know that story. Um, as you read through, again, I keep this concept that I'm working with throughout the whole time. God's building a people, and there's threats to this building. God's building a people. So the word covenant is central here, right? He's made a covenant with Abraham. The covenant continues to be ratified at different points. Different points. God ratified it with Isaac, ratified it with Jacob, ratified it with the people coming into the land, and certainly with Moses. And but it keeps coming under threat. Sometimes threat from the outside, and sometimes threat from the people themselves not understanding what God is doing. And I'm being gracious about it, not understanding, but they're also rebellious to what God is doing. You know, if we've got to be honest about it, it's not just their ignorance, it's their rebellion. It's even when seeing God at work, they rebel. One interesting thing is that Israel kept these stories in their scriptures, right? They didn't hide the fact that their ancestors rebelled, which makes the stories even more powerful when you say this is part of a legacy. We're going to keep this in here. We're not going to redact it and blot out those stories, right? We're going to show you we're going to show you what the way it was. All right. Okay. I'll go on to Deuteronomy, and probably will uh, end with Deuteronomy, or just a little taste of Joshua. Okay. Oh yes, please, please, Pastor.
I think, so one of the things that stood out in Leviticus was, or in Numbers, was the amount of times we talked about God being angry at the people, Moses interceding on their behalf. What are your thoughts on, there are a lot of people in the room who are leading in various ministries in the church. Could you say something about like
Uh,
leaders? Moses eventually doesn't make it into the promised land, because after interceding for the people all those times, he finally his anger kind of gets in the way in a moment. So what's your
yeah,
leadership?
yeah, yeah. Every time, every time I'm reminded that as an old man, I say, because every time I've left the ministry, somebody who's preaching my farewell will say something about Moses is dead and Joshua. I'm like, okay, man, why I gotta be Moses, and I can miss out on the promised land? Oh my goodness. Well, anyway, I think there's a couple of things, and I appreciate you saying that, Pastor, because if you take the two, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and take those together, I was going to say this when I get to the end of Deuteronomy, but I'll say it now. You do see this trajectory of Moses' life, right? From birth through his leadership to his death in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And it's in Exodus where he gets this powerful lesson about leadership, right? Can't do it all. And his father-in-law Jethro says, hey, you need to set up a system here where there's other people that will take care of these things, and only the big issues need to come up to you. I mean, that seems to be like leadership 101, but he needed to know this, right? He needed to experience this. So we start to see Moses grow as a leader, right? We see that. And he's been an intercessor. But we also see Moses' humanity, right? And there, so when he's told to strike the rock, which he does, and water comes out, the second time he's told to speak to the rock, and he's angry and he hits the rock. And now water still comes out, but God's like, nah, it's not just that you hit the rock. You are creating a picture of me that I don't want the folks to see. And so there was something more spiritual going on there than just his anger. There was a disregarding of something about God's character and nature. So much so that the Apostle Paul will later make this a typology and say the rock was Christ. You know, that there was this sense of honoring what God was saying, right? Well, I don't want to get so much heavily on the symbolism, but I will say in the practical part of what you said, Pastor Edwin, that there's a practical dimension of leadership, right? You can't do it all, but then the other part of the leadership is to make sure that you're taking the directions from God and not letting the exasperation of the people cause you to miss out on your blessing. You know, and I mean, I think there's something there. Now, I am going to say that God cared for Moses. I mean, Moses shouldn't have been the one to fight and get them in the land. I think God really was gracious to Moses to let him die, an old man, full of years, and not have to lead people into battle. That was the young man's job. That was Joshua's job. So I think God took care of him at the end. But poor Moses only got to see it. He didn't get to experience it. And I think part of that is this failure to see something about the character of God at a critical moment, you know. But I don't know, I think about it a lot because I think about it in my own life. So the older I get. So I don't know if it's missing out on a salvation because I think God has taken care of Moses in a very unique way. But I do think it's not that it was still a loss for Moses not to taste the fruit of the land after all that work, you know. So I'm hoping that leaders will let God deal with people, and they don't have to do all the disciplining themselves. Let God deal with people, and don't you miss out on the fruit that God might have, you know, for you. Yeah. Yeah, I think about it, like I said, a lot, but I don't have anything really super profound to say on that one. But you have thoughts? Mhm.
Yeah, it's so interesting that I was reading this part of the scripture yesterday, and it was kind of, it was sobering to say the least, because I'm looking at Miriam. She died in that area. Um, my story about this, but I'm thinking it's like totally crazy, but then Aaron died after that encounter.
That's right. That's right.
But God left Moses to still lead the people. That's one thing that was like a little puzzling to me, that Moses did not die at that time. God, I assume that it was because God still needed, I don't know, because Joshua was around. God could have killed him and say, let Joshua take his
Yeah,
place.
yeah, yeah.
Joshua was maybe God loved Moses a lot. That's one part of it. And one thing that I also realized is that Moses' sin was the same from the beginning. His besetting sin was the same from the beginning. His anger. In anger, he killed the Egyptian. He ran away. He spent all that time, and the anger came out. And so it was just something that, I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Mm, yeah.
Maybe individuals don't take care of the root problem, they'll come back and haunt us. And it may come back and haunt us.
Wow. Wow. Oh, that's interesting. Sister, I'm sorry, what's your name?
And
Abby?
like
Uh, all right. Well, I'm trying. It's going to be hard for me to capture everything. The folks online were saying they wanted to hear repeated what was said in the room. But what I'm hearing you say, at least the gist of what I'm hearing, is that you acknowledge that Miriam and Aaron both died, you know, um, before Moses, and God spared Moses even longer, which I think is actually a really good observation because sometimes we miss that part that Moses, we think about Moses missing out, but Aaron and Miriam also missed out on getting to the promised land. And you acknowledge that Moses was angry as a younger man when he killed the Egyptian, and he's angry here. And so your admonition is deal with that besetting sin before it kind of gets you. I think there's some good advice there. Did I capture some of what you were getting at?
yeah, but I wanted you to kind of comment on what you thought about why God left Moses
Oh, yeah.
very at the end.
Oh,
Because
you
it's
mean
so,
why he let him live?
but it seems as if God was actually really merciful to him. And then the other thing is what Paul said, and he said, I keep my body under. Let's
Yeah,
have this
yeah.
myself will be a Catholic. That's it.
Well, no, I think I'm hearing you. You're asking about why God, in a sense, spared Moses on that way, and you likened it to Paul's admonition to uh, um, keep our body in check. And I mean, I certainly don't disagree. I guess I don't know why questions are hard for me because they invite a certain speculation, which I think is good to have. But they're in that category of speculation, unless the scripture speaks to it itself. So I don't fully know why. I guess in a sense, Moses is really the hero of the Pentateuch, and his life is fully on display. But I would agree with you that God is merciful to let Moses get up to the hill and see the promised land, and that there's even a mercy in that he gets to see what's going to be. Now, I mean, for me, I kind of, I mean, I don't fully see it as a punishment, and maybe that's my problem. I have to reckon with that a little bit. I think for Moses to see where the people is going is great. I mean, he's an old man, and maybe that's a blessing in and of itself to see what's going to happen. I mean, it's it's Rafiki holding up on Pride Rock. It's like showing what's going to be. Even if Mustafa doesn't get to see the next generation, he gets to get a glimpse of what can be. There's something powerful in that. So I guess I want to see it as a good thing that God took him to see the promised land, to get a good view, and then to die at rest and at peace. So to me, that's a good thing. That's the end of Deuteronomy. But why questions are hard because it's speculation. But that's a good thing. It invites us to kind of reflect and think about it. Um, yeah, so I'll stop there. I mean, let me just say now. I was going to save it for the end of Deuteronomy, but at the end of Deuteronomy, when Moses dies, it's like a whole couple of chapters, that talks about this, and God is very intimate with Moses. It's just like this conversation of God and Moses. I was at a conference, and the speaker was speaking about that passage to a bunch of us pastors. And it was a woman, I still remember, Ruth Haley Barton, and she was talking to us. And I used to think about Moses being punished about not going to line. And she was the one that helped me to reframe and think about the blessing of getting at the threshold, knowing that the promise is going to be fulfilled, but you don't have to do the heavy lifting anymore. And there was something beautiful in that I was hearing. And then God quietly and lovingly sits down and has this like end of life conversation with Moses. And then the beautiful imagery at the end of Deuteronomy is that when he dies, God himself buries Moses to the point where nobody knew where his body was. It was like
Right.
God took care of him even at his death. So I've been trying to reckon that with missing out, and saying to myself, well, he missed out on the fruit. He didn't get to taste the life in the promised land, but he got the assurance that his work was not in vain. He got the people right to the threshold, And so there was something for me beautiful about that, especially as an old man. So maybe I'm just looking at it an old man's eyes. Is that even if I may not get there with you, but I know that we as a people will get to the promised land. There we go. I may not get there with you. So anyway, I like the way you're thinking though, because it's good to ask some of those questions and think about what's the big picture of God's character that we're seeing. That's always the right question to ask, right? What's the picture of God's character we're seeing? What's the picture of humanity that we're seeing when we look at a passage? And so we're looking at God's character, we're looking at humanity, and then we look at like what would a faithful posture be, right? If we want to solve a issue or want to, we're at this crossroads or we're trying to think about something. And sometimes, just for very basic Bible interpretation is not so much knowing all the stuff about the world behind the text. That's part of it, as I mentioned before, and the world within the text. But it's also the hermeneutical question of what are we seeing about God here? And what are we seeing about humanity here? Right. And so for me, in this wilderness wanderings, we're seeing the instability of people. We're also seeing how fears can overtake them when they're not sure of the outcome. And we can see how steady leadership isn't always appreciated, but is necessary. I mean, so there's a lot of lessons, right, to take from this. I mean, every pastor at some point or another has felt like they're Moses with people in the desert who only get a certain glimpse of what's going on, but have assessed that we're going in the wrong direction. Right? Every pastor has had that, where you're saying, I've been talking to God about this. I have this bird's eye view on all this. Somebody's mad up there because they got manna and they didn't get steak. So they've decided that the whole operation is for the birds, right? And depending on who that person is, it could influence everybody, right? So everybody's going through that kind of thing. And I think the book of Numbers is one of those places where we say, oh, this is not new. This is not new. This is not new. This is how leadership works, right? You got to learn how to delegate. You got to learn how to roll with it. You got to learn how to affirm the people are doing the right thing. You got to learn how to let God work it out with them, even though, you would rather just quit. And so there's some real leadership lessons in the Pentateuch for me, particularly in Numbers, Exodus and Numbers. Okay. Oh yeah, one more question. I'm still going to do Deuteronomy. So anyway, go ahead.
My thoughts are similar about it not necessarily being a punishment, because, knowing that it's the meat that died, he's also the one of grief. So I
He's
think
also what? I'm sorry.
dealing with grief of losing his sibling.
Oh.
Um,
Well, yeah, go ahead. Mhm.
so I just think, it's still showing some compassion there to allow him to live longer. And then there were many points, where Moses was really tired of the Israelites, like sick and tired. So,
Yeah,
I think that's another part too. God is like, okay, your work here is done. And then not
yeah,
only that, in the
yeah,
New Testament, he joined Jesus on the mountain of transfiguration. So if
yeah,
he's the
yeah,
ultimate pointing to Christ anyways, and he's the ultimate promised land, then can it even be argued that he didn't see the promised land of God thought I did enough for him to
Well, I appreciate you saying it. It's going to be hard for me to repeat that for the folks. Yeah, I know somebody said it. Yeah, Nestor said it too. Can you repeat the question prior to responding? Yeah, I'm trying, Nestor. I'm trying, Amy. It's Yeah. That was more of a comment about, and if I'm understanding correctly, you were acknowledging that Moses' situation, we could think of it not so much as punishment, but also as well. You acknowledge the grief he might have experienced in losing his siblings. You mentioned that, and you also mentioned the rest that he could experience from from his ministry, and then you acknowledge that he shows up in the New Testament on the Mount of Transfiguration with Elijah and Jesus, which is actually that's a pretty significant thing because Moses and Elijah become two key figures in Jewish thinking for a long time. Moses as the lawbringer, Elijah as sort of the quintessential prophet, and you see the Moses and the prophets kind of embodied in I mean the law of Moses and the prophets embodied in Moses and Elijah. So I guess I was hearing you reflect more than ask a question, right? Okay, thanks. I will do my best for the folks online to try to uh, repeat the questions. Oh, I'm seeing there was more comments than I realized. Okay, thanks. Well, let me at least get us into Deuteronomy, and then we can at least say we did the Pentateuch, and and then we'll press on. So there's a few themes that I want to highlight, and then we'll look at a couple of passages. So I'm going to do another sharing here. All right. And okay. So I quote some scholars in thinking about Deuteronomy, one of the most significant books of the Old Testament. It's the culmination of the Pentateuch. It throws the shadow of its distinctive theological perspective on the rest of the Old Testament. That last line, I'm going to emphasize in a few moments how its theological perspective starts to play out even in the rest of the Old Testament. The purpose of Deuteronomy is difficult to discern, not least because its genre is not self-evident. That's one scholar saying that It's because it doesn't fit nicely the way say Exodus storytelling plays out. It's doing something different. It tells some story, but also stops to give some long sort of discussion and reflection. So this scholar says Deuteronomy is best understood as spiritual direction. And I kind of like that because in the maturation of this nation, we're seeing the Torah, in infancy, the Ten Commandments. Then we see it elaborated upon. Then we see Leviticus spelling a lot of details out. Then we see the people growing up in the wilderness wanderings in Numbers. And then by the time we get to Deuteronomy, there's like a clearer, maybe I could say spiritual kind of tone to this book that is about a devotion to God, not just behaviors, but devotion. Deuteronomy is also a deeply traditional text that uh, more than I guess I should say any other book of the Bible provides the foundation for Judaism. That's what another biblical scholar is saying that here it's in this book that we start to see uh, what 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 becomes Judaism. Right? So we could think about how it's laid out here. There's a preamble in here that's kind of an outline, the basic start of the book, kind of laying the land here. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan, in the wilderness, on the plain, and then it says that. So they frame it as Moses talking, and that's how this book is, pretty much different from the others too. Moses is portrayed as this key prophet who's speaking for God. So it's set up right at the beginning. These are Moses' words. He's teaching. Then from verse 6 through chapter 4, it portrays the faithfulness of the king, which we find, which is kind of interesting because they don't have a king, right? So, but it describes what a faithful king should be. That's actually in Deuteronomy. And then there's a retelling of the Exodus. We have a rehearsal of what God did back in the Exodus. That's happening in the first few chapters. Then we get from chapters 5 to 11. There's the directives for the future relationship between the parties in the treaty. Now, this scholar used the word treaty, but that's the same as covenant, same as a pact. It's that agreement that God's made with His people. So love becomes the basic principle underlying the relationship between God and His people. Here, I will turn your attention to a verse. I'd like to go to chapter 6, verse 4 here. So we've come through a rehearsal of the Exodus, even with Moses reciting again what the Ten Commandments are. That's chapter 5. By the way, that's the name of the book, Deuteronomy. Deutero means second. Namas is the Greek word for law. So it's like the second iteration of the law, is the way some people have thought of the book. So you see that happening in 1 through 5. But when we get to 6, you see how the spiritual direction is to be set up in the life of the community. So I'm going to start at 6:4 and go to 9. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Let me stop there for a moment. Okay. Now this passage I learned years ago in Hebrew because I liked it, and I know it shows up in Hebrew prayers, but that word that I put on the slide, Shema, that's English characters for the Hebrew verb shema. Not shema, but they try to say it in one syllable, shema. And it's the command form of the verb to hear. So it's the imperative. Hear, listen. So Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one way it can be translated, right? Or, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord by himself, the Lord alone. So I read from the RSV, but if somebody have an NIV handy, I actually could get it on my computer, but I got too many windows open right now. But if you got the NIV handy, it'll actually, let me see. Let me just go ahead and do it.
I can do it, Pastor Dennis.
Oh, yeah, please, Pastor Edwin. Go ahead.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your heart. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, you lie down, and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates.
All right. Thank you. So, yeah, these words frame how central um, following the Lord and the affirmation of who God is. So much so that this prayer becomes a regular prayer in the life of Israel. The Shema was said daily. Hear, Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. But my translation says, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. But the point is, there's a uniqueness to Yahweh, right? That's when you see Lord, it's capital letters, like we talked about on the first day. So, Lord, but notice just the rhythm of how this is supposed to be played out in their life, right? When you love God with your whole heart, you you tell this to your children. You talk about it when you're just doing your normal stuff, when you're getting up, when you're going down, when you're walking, when you do, and then that last verse 8 seemed to be symbolic, but a lot of Jewish people took them quite literally. Bind them on the sign of your hand, fix them on. So they created little boxes and tied them around their hands to put scripture in them. So if you ever do see um, more conservative Jews or the Hasidic Jews I was telling you about earlier live in Brooklyn, you'll see that. I was on a flight. This is back in 2017. Yeah, I was still living in Minneapolis, and I had got a chance to go to Israel with a group of people who worked at different seminaries, and somebody else was paying for the trip. So I got nominated to go. I was like, yeah, I'm going. So I went on the trip, and but they flew us on El Al, which is Israel's airline. The first time I went to Israel, I flew on a different airline and have this experience. But on El Al, it's like soul plane for Jewish people. It was a very Jewish experience on that plane. People are getting in group people getting in groups and having little prayer groups. It's very family. The babies are crying and people are, dealing. And it's like, I'm clearly look different. I'm black and I'm not dressed in any stereotypical Jewish way. It was almost like I didn't exist. All this life was happening around me. But but you saw people when it was time for prayer, they would try to get a group of people to pray together in a corner, and they were looking for a number of people, a certain number of men they were looking for, and they had these prayer things bound around their arms. Sometimes if you see old pictures of Bible days and then see the Pharisees, they've got these things on their heads, right? Because he says bind them on your forehead. The old King James called them a phylactery. And Jesus actually gets mad at certain Pharisees. He said, because you make broad your phylacteries, you want them to be really big so people can see. So even in this, they turn it into, by the time of Jesus, into like a proof of spirituality, right? If you've been to some Jewish people's homes, they'll have something on the door frame called a mezuzah. A mezuzah means doorpost, and it's a little thing. We rented a house in Brooklyn, but it was owned by Jewish people. We had a little mezuzah on the door, and often you'll find a little piece of paper inside which has this prayer on it, has the smile on it inside the mezuzah, because they wrote them on the doorpost and put it on the house. So took these things very literally. They wrap them around their hands, put them on their forehead, and put them on the doorpost. But so this Shema becomes really critical. But notice the love that's in verse 5, right? That's what Jesus recites in the New Testament when he's asked, "What's the most important of the commands? What's the most important?" He says, "You love the Lord with your whole heart, with your soul, with all your might." And then he quotes Leviticus, "And you love your neighbor as yourself." Right? So that becomes uh, something that transcends, whether we folks who are Jewish or Christian, in that it's born into our identity as people of God, is that's fundamental, is this love for God. But the point I'm trying to make really is that this love becomes a theme that works its way through Deuteronomy. Let me come back to my slide and I'll end in a couple of minutes. Let me go back and share. Whoops. Where was I? Okay. So, okay, here. So you get general stipulations for how we relate to God. And then I mentioned the Shema. Then if we keep going, you start to see some what some scholars call the legal corpus. You start to see more instructions like you saw in Leviticus played out for the community in in different ways in chapters 12 to 26. In fact, one of the strongest things that comes through in there is how you care for people who are aliens and strangers, the widows and orphan. There's a powerful line in chapter 50. There should be no poor among you, which is a really powerful line. And I mean, this was this is there was a formula, a value for how you should take care of each other. Um, there's even the Jubilee, right? The time to forgive debts. I'm looking at chapter 15 right now, verse 7. If there is among you anyone in need, a member of your community in any of your towns within the land that the Lord your God has given you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your needy neighbor. You should rather open your hand, willingly lending enough to meet the need, whatever it may be. So the thing that gets me sometimes is all these people who talk about we need to be, live according to the Bible and all the Old Testament commands. They keep looking for the most violent things they can find in there. And for some strange reason, they skip over these words. You know, you should verse 10, give liberally, be ungrudging when you do this. For on this account, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all you undertake. Since there will never cease to be some in need on the earth, I therefore command you, open your hand to the poor and needy neighbor in your land. This is verse 11. So I'm trying to find that verse where he says straight out, there should be no poor among you, but I can't find it off the top of my head. But it's in this chapter. Clearly, there's a formula for taking care of that vulnerable group. So you see that in this legal corpus section, 12 to 26, these instructions for or even beyond Leviticus for organizing community life. But it almost feels like it's a solidification of this national identity. Now we know there are strangers who might come. There might be foreigners who might come, right? There's a sense of how you posture yourself vis-a-vis the other nations, not just how do you manage your household, what food you eat and don't eat. This is now how do we relate to others? And there's a lot of that happening in this section, 12 to 26. There's also a section of blessings and curses, 27 and 28. Um, and then the Lord calls upon it's I should say that it's almost like a legal contract where he calls on witnesses, but the witnesses are the heavens and the earth. He calls on the witnesses, meaning what I've created to ratify this agreement, this covenant that I'm making with you all. You see this powerful passage, choose life, you see in here in this chapter. Um, we'll read some passages in a moment, but I'm giving you a quick overview. So, and then we get the end of the life of Moses. I want to share something briefly in terms of these themes. I had a professor in my doctoral studies who was an expert in Old Testament, and he liked to talk about what he called the great Deuteronomic equation. And I put it in quotes because that's his term, but I liked it. So I save it because you'll see these terms show up in Deuteronomy, but Deuteronomy is where they start out. You'll start to see it in Joshua, in Judges, in Samuel, in Kings. So that's when that scholar says that what we see in Deuteronomy sets us up for the rest of the Old Testament. It's in Deuteronomy we start to see what fidelity to God's ways should look like, and how do you manage relationships. So, what's our relationship to God? Primarily, it's what he called the Deuteronomic equation. You'll see the writer say, fear God. You'll also see love God. You'll also see serve God, obey God, keep his commandments, walk in his ways. All of those are synonymous. And that's why he called it an equation. But you see it most starkly in Deuteronomy first, and then you start to see it play out. Right. So I like that because rather than trying to make those things be different, they are fundamentally the same thing. It's this devotion to God that they're describing. Also, you see a doctrine of retribution in here. That blessing and curses section I was just talking about. This fundamental teaching that um uh oh my goodness, we see it in the New Testament too, of reaping what you sow, right? And that starts to get play dramatically described in Deuteronomy, particularly 28 and 29, and the payback for not doing I should say that the curse is the not walking God's ways. The blessings when you do walk in God's ways, so you get what reaping what you sow. But then in your interpersonal relationships, they have what I put on the slide, the lex talionis. That's a Latin term that scholars have used to mean the law of payback. And so you'll see it there, which is if it's eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Now, what people have pointed out is that was meant to kind of calm down people's desire for revenge. You do eye for eye. You don't do whole body for eye, right? You do the kind of equal payback, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Of course, by the time we get to the New Testament, Jesus says there's a better way, right? It's a way of love. You've heard eye for eye, tooth for tooth, but I say, so he starts to expand and maybe I shouldn't even say expand. He starts to get underneath what is behind these commands, which is love again, right? So, but we see a Deuteronomistic history, which is my point of the Deuteronomic equation that scholars will call a Deuteronomic history. In other words, what we see in Deuteronomy gets played out dramatically in the other books. One quick example is the monarchy. When the kings follow the ways of God, things go well for the people. When they don't, and you see the kings as well as the priesthood, when that all gets messy, things go really poorly. Right? And then I'll say what another scholar has put: Deuteronomy is both an ending and a beginning. It's a recollection of the Exodus. It's an ending of some of the wilderness wandering, and then it's a beginning as we start to get into preparing for life in the promised land. You see that I have another slide? Okay. Yeah, there's a few things that come up in the book. I'll mention that in a moment to close out. But let me just stop there. Are you getting a sense of what I'm trying to say in terms of the transition that's happening? Okay. Oh, somebody found the verse. Thank you. It's Deuteronomy 15:4. However, there need be no poor among you, for in the land the Lord your God has given you to possess as your inheritance, he will richly bless you. So that's NIV 15:4. Thank you to, how do you pronounce that? Lawan or Lajon? I don't know. Okay, thank you. 15:4. Yeah, my NRSV says, there will, however, be no one in need among you. I mean, what a powerful um, intention that every nation has fallen short of. But God's intention was for people to take care of each other, right? Okay. So anyway, well, let me go ahead and finish, and then we'll take any last questions. Let me finish the slide there. I think there's a few topics that are controversial that show up in here that I'm just going to alert you to, but we can talk about it later. One of them, some scholars call it the ban. It's in Hebrew, it's a word called harem, not harem, which sounds like harem, like in Arabic, the harem, where they put all the women separate for the king's women, the harem. It's a similar word in Hebrew, harem, and it means also separation. And but what it's sometimes translated the ban or the devotion. So it's weird because these things are supposed to be devoted to God in the same way that a sacrifice is made to God, and it's by killing everything. And this is really hard. And scholars are still not sure what to do with that. So I give you some verses in Deuteronomy. It's going to come up again in First Samuel. I'm sorry, in Joshua, and then also in First Samuel, when God says, kill everybody and kill the animals everybody. And it's hard to know really what to do with those passages in the sense of um, understanding our New Testament commands to love. So some would say, well, God's mad in the Old Testament, but he's nice in the New Testament. That won't do. Um, but it's but we need to understand that something is happening there. And the question that we have, and so your neighbor, Greg Boyd, has written a tremendous amount on that very topic because he's trying to get us to think differently and creatively about these extermination verses in the Old Testament. And part of what what he argues is that Israel thought, I guess maybe it's one way to say it, that God wanted them to totally wipe out people, and they never did. I mean, one example is he says to wipe out the Canaanites when they go into the land of Canaan. And in the New Testament, there's a woman who comes up to Jesus begging for help for her daughter, and she's Canaanite. Now, if the Canaanites were wiped out, there wouldn't be any Canaanites, a few hundred years later. So we've got to try to understand what's happening there. So I pose it right now as a problem. I'm not going to try to solve it, but I know your minds might go there, and it's okay because if you come up with a creative solution, everybody would want to hear it. But the reality of it is, we do have those passages, and it's not just that God is doing it. That's not the problem. If you might say, well, God's entitled to punish people, that's not a problem. The problem is he has Israel do it. Right? You kill all these people. That's where it becomes a problem. It's not a problem that God certainly has the freedom to judge his creation, but telling them to do it is where it becomes complicated. But at the same time, we have these humanitarian concerns that I just read for you in chapter 15, taking care of the poor. The Levites are mentioned a lot, more than even in Leviticus. And then we see, as I mentioned, this law of the king. It's a description of what a king should be like, which is kind of funny because they don't get a king until many years later when they beg for a king. So some have said, what's going on here? Why we even get a discussion of the king before? And then when they ask for a king, it feels like they shouldn't have asked for a king. But it seems like God has an ideal king in mind, all the way here in chapter 17. I'm not going to take the time to read it. And then he also tells you what a prophet should do. So there's like the formulas is being set up for what even the monarchy and the spiritual life, I shouldn't point separately. The monarch, because they were kind of going together. The monarchy and the prophets world, what those should look like for Israel. So maybe the big picture of what we're seeing is how they are becoming this people and how their life is being ordered. All right. I'll leave this for you to have on your own. It's a slide where I put together how Moses is treated throughout the whole Pentateuch. So that's the last slide. I'll skip that for now. So let me stop. And I feel like I rushed a little bit there with Deuteronomy, but hopefully you're getting some of the picture of what's happening there, including the difficult places. And that particularly is those violent passages that I mentioned, or the total extermination passages. So, all right, let me stop and see any final comments or observations or even questions.
Some in the chat. I'm see if there's anybody who hasn't spoken.
Okay. Most of what was in the chat was really just asking to amplify what was happening in the room. So, okay.
Okay, I just wanted to comment on the when you were referencing the verse about there should be no poor among you.
Yeah. Yeah.
That made me think about in Acts when like after people were filled with the Holy Spirit and they were like in communes and they were sharing food and selling their wealth so that everybody could be provided for. And then
Amen.
also made me think about like the Good Samaritan parable, because I know like with the Pharisees and the religious leaders, they could be very hypocritical and tithe on the penny, but they also like gorging their flock and taking advantage of them economically. So those were kind of in my mind.
I'm really, oh, I'm sorry. I'm really glad that your mind went to those places because I think that's exactly what should happen, at least in my opinion. I was in a church where the pastor was taking up the offering and he brought up that passage in Acts where they had everything in common and nobody had need. The church was taking care of each other. And he said that was wrong. He said it was communism and the Lord had to break that up. And I'm sitting there saying, what? I mean, that's when your American way of thinking, overshadows the Bible because what they were doing in the early church was picking up on the Old Testament law. That's exactly what they were doing. They were picking up on the Torah instruction that they were going to practice the kind of communal life that God intended. And you're making my point for me to say the whole thing is God's building a people. And by the time we get to the New Testament, we see those people expand beyond Israel to include Gentiles too. But I'm glad that your mind went there. I think that's really good. Was there another comment before we left? Well, I know you got a bunch of them. I didn't want to. I wanted to see if there was anybody else beforehand, but I don't mean to cut anybody off. I'm sorry. Okay, I was trying to summarize your comment. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't mean to cut you off. I'm sorry. One last one.
Get the
We
final
right.
question.
Okay, we're right at the hour. Thank you. All right. Well, God bless you. Please look at the slides that I sent, and you might come up with a question. I'm going to press on next time to get into Joshua and Judges, and maybe even into Ruth. I am going canonical order, even though I'm not going the Old Testament order. But if you got questions, I'll try to answer those as best I can, or point you to some resources. So let me take a moment to pray, and I'll see you next time. Dear God, I thank you for your people and how you have worked through people throughout such a long period of time, and yet you've allowed us to have written reflections and accounts of what happened a long time ago. And Lord, as we're marching through, we get filled with questions and thoughts and ideas. And I thank you for that, Lord. And I pray that you continue to stir our thinking as we reflect on what you've done through your people throughout time. I pray for the Sanctuary Covenant Church, Lord. You would bless the church, bless Pastor Edrin and the rest of the pastoral team and staff, as well as every member and volunteer, that you would encourage them and strengthen them in their work. Lord, guide us, we pray in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right. Thank you all. I'll see you next time.